Brief Document B Volume 1. As I said, we're going to focus very much on dwelling houses. ADB Volume 1 includes flats. We're not going to focus on flats today. And as I said, there's a whole raft of information that we're not going to be able to cover within relating to dwelling houses. I'm going to try and pick out the key pertinent points. So, the idea is for you to get really a basic comprehension of fire safety requirements and understanding what it all means. ADB replicates, unsurprisingly, the requirements of Schedule 1, Part B in the building regulations. So that's B1, means of escape, B2, internal fire spread of linings, B3, internal fire spread of structure, B4, external fire spread, and B5, access and facilities for the fire service. So those are the requirements of Schedule 1, B1 down to B5. And a bit of time for questions for me and questions for you guys at the end as well. That's ADB, that's what it looks like. So, Schedule 1, B1. The building should be designed and constructed so that there are appropriate provisions for the early warning of fire and appropriate means of escape in case of fire from the building to a place of safety outside the building, capable of being safely and effectively used at all material times. That is the legal requirement. Layman's terms, you can get out of the building safely in the event of a fire. An ADB is split into a number of sections, and the first section that we're going to have a look at is general provisions. So, this is where it makes it's clear that an approved document makes reference to British standards. So, ADB makes reference to BS 5839-6, which is the British standard for smoke alarm systems in domestic circumstances. So it says that all dwellings should have a fire and detection alarm system in accordance with grade D2 LD3. I won't go through the different requirements relating to BS 5839-6, but in essence, the grade D2 LD3 is a circulation type system. Any circulation spaces in those locations. A couple of other British standards for heat alarms and smoke alarms and their accordance for those manufacturers' requirements. So where that varies is if we've got a large dwelling house. So large dwelling house under provisions of ADB is when it's got a floor area of more than 200 metres squared. And in those instances, it should have a grade A LD3 fire detection system rather than a grade D system in accordance with BS 5839-6. And a large dwelling house with 3 or more stories is when we're looking at an LD2 system. And that's in the instance where we have similarity to BS 5839-1, which is suitable for commercial systems. So we're looking at fire alarm panels and similar. These are in large dwelling houses. Now, I was talking to a couple of people in the break and they were talking about extensions and similar. In the last session, we were talking about extensions and similar. And one of the things that is often missed, I think, in terms of architectural plans, but also contractors, is that if we create, as part of the works that we're doing, a new habitable room above or below the ground story, or a habitable room on the ground story which doesn't have a final exit, e.g. a door, then we need to add a smoke detection system in accordance with BS 5839-6. Which means that if you're adding an inner room or a first floor extension or a loft conversion, this is the requirement that details the need for additional detection system in accordance with that relevant British standard. And then depending on the size of the dwelling would determine the grade of the detection system itself. Now, a couple of key bits of terminology. So an emergency escape window. These are windows, without unsurprisingly I suppose, that can be utilised in the event of a fire as escape. And for them to be classified as an emergency escape window, they need to meet the dimensions of 0.33 metres squared, 450 in any direction, and that results, in reality, of a 450 by 750 window, basically. And it can't be any higher than 1100 millimetres in height. That's what an escape window is. Sorry, was there?
Is that the sill?
So it doesn't stipulate, it's the bottom of the openable area, rather than sill, but.
So the original idea of loft conversion,
Yeah.
we used to have a Velux on the front elevation so far people would get up. And the sill was important.
Yeah, so under the previous iteration of ADB, what you had was in Velux windows, the idea behind it, and bear in mind this is previous iterations, so no longer applicable now, but previous iterations was that if you had a Velux window with a loft conversion, that you had sufficient space, I think from memory 1200 millimetres, on the roof itself, so that people could get out of Velux and sit on the roof and get rescued by the fire. I think the reality of that, and going back, I'll talk about this in terms of fire safety, the reality that each and every individual who's in a loft conversion or up that third story would be able to do that is probably why it's been removed from the guidance. But these are the general provisions. So emergency escape window, 0.33, 450, in essence 450 by 750, no more than 1100. And also often missed is the distance that if they're going into a rear garden, for example, a landlocked garden, that they should be able to get 2 times away the mean height of the roof away from the building. So if you've got a long back garden, completely fine. If you have a very small back garden, you might have some of the issues, and you may well need to be able to go around a side gate or something similar to be able to get out of the building sufficiently far away. It's all about, under B1, being able to get to a place of safety itself. Any questions? Oh, windows should be capable of remaining opening without being held, because if you ever try to escape out a window and it's closing and smashing you in the face, it's not going to work. So it needs to be staying
Sorry,
open.
the 200 metres square,
Yes.
do a lot of measurements where they're over a certain height in the roof conversion itself. 200 we're talking about, or is it
Floor area. So the 200 metres squared is relation to designation of that building as a large dwelling house, and that's floor area. So
whatever height it is irrelevant.
exactly that. Yeah, for that purpose.
For that.
For that purpose. Obviously, floor height does have massive implications elsewhere, but bearing in mind that I'm trying to focus on dwelling houses, realistically, we're going to be focused on 2- and 3-storey dwellings. So that's the general provisions talking about emergency escape windows and similar. One thing which I think is commonly misunderstood as well is the provision of inner rooms. So an inner room, by definition, is that in the event of a fire, you would have to go through an access room to be able to escape the building. Access room, so from simple perspective, if on the ground floor you have a study, and the only way that you can get out into the front door is through a lounge or a kitchen via another door that leads into that access room. Therefore, that study is an inner room. Now, inner rooms are permitted in certain circumstances. One of them is that if you have a floor height of no more than 4.5 metres above external ground level, then you can have an emergency escape window. However, if you're going above that, then inner rooms aren't permitted to be mitigated by an emergency escape window. Inner rooms can also be permitted if they're a kitchen, a laundry room, or a dressing room, or a WC or a shower room. Those types of inner room, like en-suites and similar, are permitted under section 2.11. Any?
That's a good question.
Yeah, of course.
I had one recently when I did a downstairs extension,
Yeah.
which was kitchen, utility and toilet.
Yes.
So kitchen, then door into utility,
Yes.
door into the toilet,
Yes.
then utility.
Yeah, in a room. Yeah.
In a room.
Yeah.
Yeah, the local authority didn't like that. There's no windows in either utility or the toilet.
Sanitary facilities, bathroom, WC or shower room is permitted. Utility room is fine. So 2.11 says.
They wouldn't back down.
I'd point them towards 2.11. Again, I know you did. No, I think
It's just a window, we have to put one in the toilet.
I think the point goes back to, again, we're all servants of the law, and building control bodies, we have to apply the law, and the guidance, ADB, says that. I can't criticise any other building control body, but hypothetically, that's what it says. So any questions on inner rooms at all? Any thoughts? Good. So this diagram in ADB, I think, is really, really beneficial. It's kind of misleading a little bit, but it gives you an indication. So that bungalow on the top left-hand side, in essence, for a ground story only, the means of escape is suitable by either having rooms that go into a central corridor, or they have emergency escape windows or external doors. Pretty simple. If you have a dwelling house with 1 story at less than 4.5 metres, then you can have either emergency escape windows on the first floor or a protected stair. Now, it's kind of misleading because it gives an indication that, say, we'll come to the free story next, that if you're using this free story example, it kind of indicates that on the ground floor, you don't need to have a protected corridor. That's not the case. So using that diagram on the bottom left-hand side, free story, we've got 1 story above 4.5 metres in ground level. You need to have a protected stairway. Definition of a protected stairway is FD20 doors installed with fire-resistant enclosures of 30 minutes from top to bottom, circulation spaces. That's it. That's how you comply.
Sorry, can I keep on talking?
No, it's honestly, it's perfect. Thank you.
Roof space.
Yes.
You get a roof space conversion, and they don't put any doors at that level. They put a door down on first floor level. So you have direct access to the top, and similarly, putting an access through a bedroom to get into the top.
I'll come to loft conversions. I promise I'm going to answer that next. Because, yeah, we call them loft conversions in ADB, but roof conversions, exactly the same thing. In terms of measurement, it's worthwhile mentioning that the measurement of the highest story is dependent on its distance to the external ground level. That's how we measure it. Then when you're going up to a 4-story, in that diagram where we've got 2 or more stories above 4.5 metres, we're looking at sprinklers in accordance with 9251, not misting systems, I'll come to that in a bit, no inner rooms or an alternative escape route, basically external staircases, or if you can actually provide an alternative escape route. So, as an example, this was a material change of use under 5A, B1's applied. They did originally, I don't know if you can see on that plan on the left hand side, oh, we've got a pointer, haven't I? They did originally have a staircase over here, and the architect was looking at a proposal where they would have an alternative means of escape with fire-resistant enclosure between the two, but it didn't work out. And in essence, what they ended up doing is having internal fire-rated doors, internal fire-rated enclosures, and a protected corridor from top to bottom. Thinking about the regulation side of that, the session 1 we talked. Regulation 5A imposes a requirement. B1 is the requirement, needs to fully comply. B1, the requirement on the left-hand side. How did they comply? They met the guidance in ADB Volume 1, protected corridor, protected stairway from top to bottom. Now, galleries and basements. We don't come across them that often, but they do occur. It's worthwhile mentioning, so a gallery, most people would call it a mezzanine, but in ADB it's called a gallery. So this is when we have a situation with a partial upper story in the same room. And they can only, the risk is, obviously, that if you were sleeping or in that upper story, in the event of a fire, you would be cut off from your means of escape from the staircase going down to the exit. And so ADB, in terms of diagram 2.6, sorry, provides a number of bits of guidance, a number of requirements, which is 7.5 metres max from the head of the stair to the furthest point within the gallery itself, and a maximum of 3 metres from the foot of the stair to the exit door, and that there should be more than a visible area of 50%. The theory being is that if you're on that upper story and you can see more than 50%, the likelihood is that you will be able to see a fire occurring on that lower level. The alternative to that is that on that upper story you could have an alternative exit, whether that's an external exit, external staircase or similar, or if the height is only 1 story above 4.5 metres, if the height of the story is above 4.5 metres, then you could have an emergency escape window as well, in accordance with section 2.10, 450, 0.33, yada, yada, yada. The other thing, which is often missed, I think, particularly from designs that we see come across our desk, is relating to basements. And we'll come to loft conversions in a second, but basements, in essence, should be treated in exactly the same way as loft conversions. So if you create a basement story, that basement should terminate into a protected stairway. And that's the point. Just because you have first floor means of escape windows and the ground floor, all of the rooms terminate into an access hallway, if you have a basement, then the entirety of the escape route should be a protected stairway itself, in which case you should upgrade the internal doors, upgrade the fire-resistant enclosures themselves. Any questions on those two? Yes?
Just regards to the staircase to that gallery,
Yes.
any considerations in regards to that?
In terms of parquet, or?
In terms of, yeah, I mean, any...
So there's no...
Is a ladder, effectively?
Well, no, so the stairs would come under parquet, in which case you're looking at ADK guidance with internal risers going and all that sort of stuff.
Cool.
It should be suitable for means of escape, in which case parquet would kick it.
Got it.
It's an interesting point in the interaction with parquet and an ADB, because going back to loft conversions, I promise we will talk about, if you had a ground floor, first floor, and then second floor, you know, often, I say often, once in a blue moon, we'll have a proposal that they'll be putting a ladder from the first floor to the second floor. And in ADK, it doesn't stipulate that a ladder is not permissible. However, in ADB, it stipulates the staircases should be suitable for means of escape. And if you've got a ladder and you've got a smoke-filled corridor, it's not going to be permissible for, so, you know, alternative treads, all those kind of funky staircases are not going to be permissible under ADB. Now,
sorry, just a question on that.
Yeah, of course.
Funky staircases,
Yes.
spiral staircases. You sometimes find an abomination, but they take out the staircase, put in a iron spiral staircase between ground and first floor level. How does that work in terms of escape and fire resistance?
so there's two things to say. There should be a fire resistance to the internal staircase itself if it's going to be utilised for the purposes of escape. So I say that as relatively controversial, but there was previously some BCA guidance, the Building Control Alliance guidance, which has now been superseded, but in the past it stipulated there should be a fire resistance to the staircase itself, because if you are utilising that staircase for the means of escape from a second floor or a first floor as part of a protected stairway, then it should still be in place, basically, if a fire were to get into that stair. The second point is, going back to ADK, which is the guide, not to teach other staircases, the guidance for staircases. There is an alternative method, as we know, to approved documents, which is BS 5395. BS 5395 provides guidance on a whole raft of staircases, including paddle staircases and spiral staircases. I haven't seen one utilised for a means of escape provision. I think it would depend, if I was assessing it, I think it would depend on what the proposals were and the suitability of that staircase. I'd have to have BS 5395 in front of me to see its suitability in terms of means of escape. I think it should be suitable, but I'd have to double check. But other alternatives under BS 5395, your alternating tread, which I have seen in the past, wouldn't be permissible for means of escape. Have we got some IT issues? There we go. Any other questions on that at all? Brilliant. Now, yes?
I mean, presumably because that's like a loft apartment with a Mexican, so the whole apartment is bringing in a circulation space for fire protection.
So, sorry.
So the whole loft in a loft apartment with a gallery, sorry, call it a Mexican.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
But that whole thing is a circulation space.
Yeah, exactly. So you would be there's you would expect to see smoke detection on both the higher level and the lower level. Yeah. External escape stairs. So we've talked a lot about alternative escape routes. And just in relation to that, BS 539-6 provides guidance regarding galleries. I think they term them mezzanines in 5396 as well, in terms of where they should be located. So this is part of an approved document. They make lots of reference to British standards as well, so unpicking it all is relatively complex. External escape stairs. So talked a little bit about, in instances with 4 stories, or if you've got an inner room on the 3rd story, where you need to have an alternative escape method. One of the options is an external escape stair, which sometimes is feasible, other times not, potentially from an aesthetic point of view. But if you have those, then what you're looking for is fire-resistant construction abutting onto that staircase. Going back to your question again, yes, it would need to be in accordance with Part K because it's an external escape stair for the purposes and means of escape, or BS 5395. The need for fire resistance is within 1800 millimetres of the stair itself, and lower down from 9 meters below the steps themselves as well, and any openings onto the staircase, if they're doors, would need to be FD30 doors, or if they're windows, would need to be REI 30 and fire fixed shut as well. So, coming to your point about loft conversions. The first section at the top there talks about replacement windows. And what it says basically is that if you're going to that provision of no more unsatisfactory, if you're replacing the window that's being utilised for means of escape, then you shouldn't be reducing the opening area. So this is something that competent person schemes, FENSA for example, should be fully aware of if they're replacing windows, and those are the only works that are taking place. The other element to talk about, loft conversion. So this is the instance where if we are adding from a 2-storey dwelling onto a 3-storey dwelling, then we should create a protected route. And the protected route is the provision of FD20 door with fire-resistant construction of 30 minutes fire-resistant construction. You may well say, well, it should be FD30 doors. What the regulations say is it should be FD20, but we all know that there aren't really any FD20 doors being manufactured out there, which is why everyone installs FD30 doors, but that's what it says. There is an alternative to section 2.21. Sorry, did that answer your question about the, I do apologise. What was it?
Slightly. What I was saying is you can get a lot of conversion.
Yeah.
And it has a staircase down to the first floor.
Yes.
No door at second floor level.
Yep.
And so does that comply? And or alternatively, if they run the staircase up to a bedroom.
So, no, if I'm completely honest. So the two options that you have in ADB is that you should have a full escape route, protected corridor, top to bottom, FD20/30 doors with fire-resistant construction, 30 minutes. That's it, with circulation spaces alarmed in accordance
You've
with...
got no gap between the bedroom and that door on the first floor.
So you're suggesting that you have an open plan arrangement on the ground floor, so the staircase terminating into an...
It absolutely complies down to the bottom.
Right.
When we get to the first floor,
Yep.
you open a door, in front of you is a staircase.
Right.
Going up to another room.
Yes. That would be fine because you've created a protected corridor. It's just the point that you've moved the door from the second floor to the first floor itself. So as long as you have a protected corridor, i.e. 30 FD20 separation between any habitable room onto the circulation splinter. It does, yes. Correct.
The same as if
No.
you drive it up to a bedroom.
No, that's different because in those instances, if you had a bedroom on the first floor and the staircase terminated, the second floor staircase terminated into the first floor bedroom, what you have on the second floor is an inner room because the second floor bedroom has to pass through the access room, which is the bedroom on the first floor, which makes the second floor bedroom an inner room. And in those instances, an inner room is not permitted on the third floor, even without an escape window. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, or I've literally just had one exactly like that, where there's a small, it's not conversion, 3-bed semi-detached house.
Yeah.
Smallest bedroom is the access point to the staircase.
Yes.
The loft.
Yes.
So it's got that room's there, and we've got like an ante-room to the bedroom, like a wardrobe space.
Right.
And that was meant to be all open plan, go to the top,
Yeah.
gallery, bedroom.
Yes.
That was refused because they called it a gallery.
The difficulty that you have is that first floor, what it's used for.
Yeah.
So,
It's too small for a bedroom.
so the problem is that when you make an assessment of an application in place for your drawings, if that first floor could be utilised as a habitable space, even if it's a desk or they're getting overcrowded and somebody has another child or whatever, and then it's a cot that's going in there, then you have a significant impact because the second floor becomes an inner room. So I have had instances like that. I think it's factor and degree. Say regulations are black and white, and I prove another example when they're not. But on a first floor room, if it's any possibility of that being utilised as a habitable room, then the second floor becomes an inner room, and then it's not permissible.
Sorry.
Yes.
So if you've got a 3-storey Victorian, Edwardian, or worse still, Georgian house that's likely to be listed,
Yep.
are you expected to replace all the doors if they're still fitted with the original features?
Well, it would depend on what works you were doing. So, I had the conversation, it's Barry, isn't it? Yeah, I had a conversation with Barry earlier on. The building regulations, as we talked about session 1, kick in when building works takes place as defined under Regulation 3 and Regulation 4. So if you are undertaking building works, then yes, the impact in terms of Schedule 1. So using your example, first thing to say is listed buildings are not referenced in ADB. They are in Part F, ADF, and they are in Part L. They are not referenced in ADB. The reason being is that anybody who lives in a listed building has exactly the same rights to be able to escape in the event of a fire than somebody living in a modern building. The second thing to say is, so if you have an existing building, a listed building, 3-storey, and you create an open plan arrangement on the ground floor, you are making the situation worse in terms of Regulation 4 because you have a staircase terminating into a lounge or a kitchen or whatever it is, and therefore you would need to mitigate it. Now, there's two things to say, which I was talking to Barry about during the break, is you would need to make a judgment on the assessment of the existing doors and the existing partitions about how much worse you are making it. Because if you have a listed building and it's wattle and daub and internal doors which have no specific fire resistance, there is still an inherent fire resistance within any door itself, and it will prevent the spread of smoke. So just because you have a very old building with wattle and daub and an existing door which is maybe panelled and got holes in, it would still limit the spread of smoke and fire. And therefore, by creating an open plan on the ground floor with a staircase terminating into a lounge or a kitchen, you are making the situation worse, and therefore you would expect compliance to ADB, which would be the provision of FD20 doors, fire-resistant enclosures, etc., etc. Now again, you can vary from the guidance in terms of ADB, but the tendency is towards liability of non-compliance.
What about horsehair plaster?
Well, I think it's important to note that you need to make a judgment of what the fire resistance of those internal partitions was originally. And this goes back to what we talked about last session, principal designers, principal contractors.
But do we know even the fire resistance of such a...
Are you competent to make the judgment of what the fire resistance of that was?
No, but it's only published information as to what the fire resistance of such a...
So that wasn't a leading question, I wasn't trying to be difficult. So if you're not competent to make the decision about what that fire resistance was originally, then you should go out and seek the advice of somebody who's competent to do so. Because if you're not, then you can't make a judgment on how it complies to the building regulations by the works that you're proposing. Now if you don't know what it was, and you're creating an open plan arrangement, then the safest option is to comply to ADB, which is either a protected corridor from top to bottom, protected circulation spaces, or 2.23 says provide a sprinkler provision for the open plan areas, provide sorry, I've seen your hand, I'll come to you in 2 seconds, saves your hand. Provide fire resisting partitions to separate the ground from the first story, which is I think that you're alluding to there, and separate cooking facilities from the open plan area with fire resisting construction. So sprinkler systems in accordance with BS 9251, not misting systems in accordance with BS 8458. But if you're not competent to make the assessment of what the fire resistance of those partitions was, then you should go and speak to somebody or seek confirmation from formal guidance, the IFE, Historic England, about what the fire resistance of those components were.
Is the local authority competent to do that? You made the comment earlier that the local authority may not be competent.
No, I didn't make the comment that local authorities were competent. I think it goes back to the point about what building control bodies are. So I don't criticise any local, I'm sure I've made mistakes, I'm sure we all have. I just referenced the guidance. Now, it's important, I know we're going to talk about this last session, but it's important to know that those who are designing building work are fully responsible for designing and building in accordance with the building regulations, not the building control body. It's our role as a building control body to assess offers of compliance. And I'll come to that in the last session. But if you're particularly under the duty holder regime, again we'll talk about it at the end, you will need to sign that you've designed and contractor built in accordance with the building regulations via a compliance declaration. So if you're not competent to do it, you shouldn't be doing it, and you should seek the advice of somebody who is competent to do so.
Doesn't help when you're doing it retrospectively, are you doing a survey on an existing building?
If it was an existing building and it's not having building works done, then the building regulations wouldn't kick in. It would be an existing building itself that you're surveying.
Unless the building works had already happened, like the provisions of new bathrooms, etc.
Yeah, so if you're looking to make what's known as, we'll come to this at the end, but if we're looking to make a regularisation application for existing work that's taken place in the past, then the same requirements would be kicking in, but it's about the requirements at the time that the works took place. We'll come to regularisations at the end. It's really important, and that's why I started with session 1, because I know a number of you are general practice surveyors. It's really important that building regulations only apply legally when you undertake building work under Regulation 3. Regulation 3 applies, then Regulation 4. If you're surveying an existing house or somebody's surveying under the FSO, then the building regulations won't necessarily kick in unless you're undertaking building work.
Am I right in thinking that building regulations can only be applied retrospectively within the first 4 years of the completion of the works?
Do you mind if we come to that at the end?
Yeah.
No, it's fine. So they've made very briefly, they've made amendments to Section 35 and Section 36 of the Building Act. Section 36 now has extended the liability period to 10 years. So that has been extended, and there is no time limit in terms of other provisions, particularly under the Defective Premises Act, which a very famous case went through the courts a couple of weeks ago. So I think things have significantly changed via, well, I know things have significantly changed from the Building Safety Act relating to retrospective works. I promise we'll come to building control at the last session. Sorry, yes?
You partially answered the question.
Yeah.
I did a survey last week, 3-storey townhouse, wasn't listed.
Yeah.
The 2 bedrooms upstairs on the 2nd floor,
Yep.
pre-existed
Yep.
50 years ago, or
Yep.
whatever. So there was obviously the building regs don't apply, they weren't doing any changes, but it's more about advice.
Yes.
What advice? It had smoke detectors on each landing.
Yes.
The doors weren't fire doors, it was, you know.
So I think, I was talking to Barry about this earlier on, I think where I would utilise the guidance is advisory aspects relating exactly that. So you can say, when you do your pre-acquisition surveys, that if the building were built now, the current layout and design would not meet the requirements of the building regulations. Part B1, Schedule 1. You can say that when you do a pre-acquisition survey. And you can, perfect. And then you can go on to say, ADB Volume 1 says this. Now, there's no legal requirement for you to do this unless you start doing other building works as defined within Regulation 3. But if you do, you should be aware. So you speak to your client and they say, oh, you know, in 6 months' time, we're going to open up the ground floor. Well, maybe then what you should think about is explaining to them that if you're doing these works, additional requirements would kick in.
I think that's a given. It was more about what other advice could you give other than smoke detectors. I said you could put a sprinkler system or another sort of alarm system in, but...
So ADB is clear that it says protected corridor or a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251. But I'll come to next.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Go on.
This might be just beyond your field.
No.
Indemnity policies provided during the complaints against non-compliance of building regs used to come in after 4 years. They wouldn't insure you for the first 4 years. Has it now moved out to 10 years on those insurance policies?
I can't profess to be an expert regarding indemnity policies. The only thing I would say is that many of the indemnity policies are, because I know, because I sourced the PI for my own company, went under significant changes after the introduction of the Building Safety Act because of the additional risk, and that resulted in increased costs and premiums. Under the DPA, the Defective Premises Act, there is now an extension of 30 years, which was a case between BDW, which is Barrett and David Wilson Homes, and URS, which is an engineering company, which came to the High Court 2 weeks ago. And they confirmed that BDW could seek action against, I know I'm going off on case law, but that's fine, but they could seek action against an engineering firm for non-compliances to the building regulations that resulted in defects under the building safety, under the building regulations. So that has been confirmed in the High Court, and that has big implications in terms of existing works, old works, and our liability for them for works we've done a number of years ago. And I think it's important to note that the courts will act in the public interest, and the public interest at the moment is the opinion, and I speak to lots of lawyers and solicitors, is the opinion that buildings are not being constructed correctly, and therefore they're trying to protect homeowners and end users by the defects that are being latent within historical works, and that is going through the courts as we speak. So yes, I can't profess to be an expert in terms of liability and premiums and all the rest of it. The only thing I do know is that your liability associated with historical works, particularly under the DPA, is significantly more than it was prior to the Building Safety Act.
I was not so much talking about PR, but roughly the insurance policies that get sold when the solicitors find during the conveyance that the building regs have not been signed off. You can get an insurance policy that it won't be enforced.
Yeah, so
They're a complete waste of time.
correct.
As soon as a local authority turn up on site, that policy falls through.
So I am aware of those PI insurance policies, and I wouldn't put in so blunt terms, but very much feel the same way. So in essence, those premiums that people have previously put in place, you know, Section 35 and Section 36 have been bumped up and increased in terms of timescales so that a local authority can take enforcement action against the person who owns that building, irrespective of who owned it previously. Now, if the defect was created in the previous owner, it's the building itself. You are now the new owner. You've taken on that responsibility. Now, the previous, those PI provisions, I didn't think they had any legal standing in the past. And if I'm completely honest, I think they were a result of local authorities not taking enforcement action generally, which still they are not doing, but I suspect that will change in the future. And I think with enforcement action, those premiums, those indemnity provisions, all those sorts of things, I don't think they'll stand up in the courts, if I'm completely honest. It's my humble opinion. Good. So I've gone off a bit of tangent, but that's fine. So the other thing to say is that for loft conversions, you don't just have to follow ADB, as is always the case. You don't have to follow the approved documents. There is an alternative. So I talked about BS 991 before, and the 2024 iteration, and I thought it was just worthwhile mentioning the differences between the 2015 iteration, and the 2024 iteration. So what Table 2 did in BS 991 2015 is list what was known as permitted variations, one of which was loft conversions. So if 991 provided the same guidance as AEB, protected corridor, protected stairway. But the permitted variations for a loft conversion was that you would have, and this is your point you were talking about before, where an open plan arrangement exists at ground level, one of the following should be provided: a fire-resistant partition to enclose, which basically protect the corridor, or an AWFSS system to the open plan area, together with a fire-resistant partition door to separate the ground floor from the upper stories. This door should be arranged so that the occupants of the loft room are able to access an escape window in accordance with 5.1 in first floor level in the event of a fire in the open plan area. Now, what 2015 iteration of 991 did is it provided equivalence between a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251 and a misting system in accordance with 8458. And what the 2024 iteration of 991 has done is completely remove any reference to misting systems whatsoever. Now, I've spoken to the authors of the 2024 iteration of 991, and the reason they've done this is a number of things. Again, their opinion, not mine. Firstly, that the misting system companies don't have a very good reputation. Their concerns are that they're more interested in sales rather than public safety. The second element is that misting systems only have a record of use of about 20 or 30 years, whereas sprinkler systems in one form or another have actually been in use in England and Wales for over 150 years. The third component is that, you know, where we're based now, or at least where I live, there's a lot of hard water, and the nozzle head of a misting system is much, much, much smaller in comparison to that of a sprinkler head. So the concern is that if that misting head is retained and you know, there for 15 years, and it's been hardened, then the actual calcification of that sprinkler misting head, will result in it not being able to be fit for purpose in the event of a fire. And that kind of leads into the next one, which is two things. One, that the provision of maintenance on a misting system in comparison to a sprinkler system in a domestic setting is much, much, much less likely to take place. in comparison to a commercial building. Commercial buildings under the RO have provisions for maintenance, i.e. the responsible person has a legal requirement. In a domestic setting, 3 people could move in, the information, although legally they should have done, wouldn't have been passed across, no maintenance will take place. In the event of a fire, that product will not would be in place as it should have been. So that's the reasoning why they've removed misting systems from 991 2024 and removed that equivalence to sprinkler systems. That is not to say that you cannot install misting systems on a domestic setting. However, you are moving away from ADB and you're moving away from 991. So really, you should speak to a competent professional, i.e. a fire engineer, to determine that the design that you've got from the misting company in conjunction with your architectural design is going to meet the functional requirements of Part B. It doesn't sit with any guidance anymore. Just to say, 991 2024, unlike an approved document, there is no transitional arrangements. 2015 ceased to be in force. 2024 comes in straight away towards the end of last year. I think it was October. And that's worthwhile mentioning relating to 991. I know we're talking about ADB, but trying to focus on domestic instances. So 991 provides additional flexibility for open plan arrangements. So if you have an LD1 fire detection system and a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251 for the entirety of the building itself, and the escape is via an open plan arrangement, when we're talking about here, as long as you have 2 escapes and a void of 1.8 metres and an additional void of 900 millimetres, then that is permitted under 991. So again, 991 provides that additional flexibility for design rather than ADB. ADB is very prescriptive in terms of that requirement. And that kind of goes on to what we were talking about before, with older British standards referenced in the approved document, a lot of confusion within the industry, that you could continue to use 2015 iteration of ADB, purely because there's a frequently asked questions in ADB produced by Headship Government that says if an older standard is referenced, you can continue to use that standard, irrespective of the fact that that older standard is updated. The point is, though, that 991 is only referenced in the approved document B in one instance, which is relating to flat or balcony access. So if you wanted to, you could design your entirety of your dwelling to ADB Volume 1, and you could design the flat and balcony access to 991 2015, and you would still be protected by the government sanctioned by Section 6 of the Building Act. Any other variation, you'd have to use the 2024 iteration of 991. Yes?
Sorry, so just going back to the MIS system.
Yeah.
I have used them in the past.
Yes.
Say, for example, so we make an application to AL, and we get the fire report
Yes.
stating it complies with ADB.
Yes.
You will then sign it off, I assume,
Well,
it's installed in accordance with whatever.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that you're going outside of ADB, you're going outside of 991. That's the reality. So we need a competent person to determine, and I'll come to the role of building control bodies later on, but you know, with all professional skill and judgment, we need to make a judgment as a building control body whether it complies. Now, what that looks like from our internal policy, don't know what other building control bodies are doing, but we ask for a competent fire engineer to say that it meets the functional requirements of B1. Now, when we receive that report, we'd review it and we go, yes, we agree, or no, we don't. We can still say, no, we don't. I think that's important to know. But we would, I think any building control body would hope to explain why we don't agree with that.
It's very enlightening.
So that's B1. We've talked loft conversions, we've talked extensions, we've talked alarm systems, we've talked sprinkler systems, we've talked misting systems, and we've talked about the permitted variations. Any questions on B1 whatsoever? No. Good. B2 is mercifully relatively simple. So B2 is internal fire spread linings. The requirements, Schedule 1, to inhibit the spread of fire within the building, the internal linings shall adequately resist the spread of flame over their surfaces and have, if ignited, either a rate of release or a rate of fire growth which is reasonable in the circumstances. Pretty simple. Table 4.1 in ADB is the relevant table to look at when you're relating to B2. And the classifications are given in terms of the location of the room itself, the location of the linings. So in circulation spaces within a dwelling, the requirement is class C, S3, D2. Now this is a European classification in accordance with BSEN 13501, and it produces a classification from A, the best, all the way down to F, the worst, and then S is the smoke production, and D is the droplet production. So it's what happens to that internal lining when it's exposed to the propagation of flame. Does it melt? Does it produce smoke, etc.? And circulation spaces in dwellings CS3D2. That's B2. B3 is basically fire resistance. So Schedule 1, internal fire spread. The building should be designed and constructed so that in the event of a fire, its stability will be maintained for a reasonable period. Then talks about common walls in two buildings, so we're talking about compartmentation. And it talks about, basically, where reasonably necessary to inhibit the spread of fire within the buildings, measures shall be taken to an extent appropriate to the size and intended use of the building, comprising either or both of the following: subdivision of the building with fire-resistant construction and installation of automatic fire suppression systems. And it goes on to say the building should be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. Talking about Grenfell earlier on during the break. So, periods of fire resistance. The generic response is that a roof is not an element of structure, but it's not quite as simple as that. So, to provide a bit of basic understanding, if you had a two-storey dwelling, the roof structure above the loft space, if it was an uninsulated, uninhabited space, that roof structure would not need to have a fire resistance. The reason for that is that it's not supporting any habitable space, which means that people need to get out of there in the event of fire. That's the provisions under B3. Now, there's a bit more, yes?
Is it similar to this one?
Well, let's use this as an example. So, relating to B3, it becomes much, much more complicated when you have complex roof structures, such as this. Because if it's contributing to the stability of an other element, a wall, for example, or a compartment, that roof structure would need to be fire resistant, particularly if you have roof members that are passing through a compartment, which does happen particularly with older buildings. And in those instances, the fire resistance should be maintained on the roof structure itself. This is actually a question that we often ask to structural engineers when we complete a plan check, particularly with older or historic buildings. So, for example, if the structural engineer had designed a gallery, let's call it a floor, running through the centre line of this because we're converting it into a dwelling, then the expectation would be that that floor would have a fire resistance. Now, if that floor is reliant on the structure of the vertical post that we have split down the building itself, then the vertical posts would also need to have a fire resistance. And then it's down to the job of the structural engineer to dictate how far that path of structural requirement goes into the roof structure itself. Does this beam require a fire resistance? Is it structurally integral to the floor that's going in? That's the question that often we ask the structural engineers to confirm. In most instances, it's pretty simple. Domestic dwelling, you've got a roof, it doesn't need fire resistance. The only other thing to say is that in loft conversions, normally in a domestic instance, we'll come to that in a minute, the fire resistance is REI 30, where R is a resistant collapse, E is insulation, and I is integrity. In loft conversions, where you've only got one story added, a maximum of 2 habitable rooms, and the new story has a maximum total of 50 metres squared, rather than REI 30, then the existing first story construction can be R30. So that requirement for integrity and insulation is removed. So a lot easier to achieve. Going back to listed buildings when we're talking about loft conversions there, just because if it has a loft and plaster, and if we're applying retrospective applications to existing buildings, that removal of E and I, integrity and insulation, becomes a hell of a lot easier to achieve that requirement.
Mike?
Yeah, of course.
So if the roof supports some plan,
let's say some condensers sitting on the flat roof.
Yep.
I'm guessing that needs to then, it becomes load bearing.
Well, it's not a story, so I wouldn't say so, no, because it's not a load-bearing element of structure. So it says, sorry, 5.3, so the following is excluded from definition of element structure: a structure that supports only a roof unless either of the following applies. Roof performs the function of a floor, such as a roof terrace, or as a means of escape. The structure is essential for the stability of an external wall that needs to be fire resisting. So I would say, other than those instances, generally a roof structure wouldn't need to be fire resistant. Now,
There can be planned on the roof and you don't have to.
well, I think in a domestic setting, which I'm trying to focus on, it's very unlikely that you're going to have plants on the roof. In a commercial setting or in a HRB situation, then I think it would be a different circumstance, because the plant itself may well be necessary for the functions of fire safety provisions within the building itself. And if that's the or the function of the building itself. Now, if that's the case, then I would expect, probably under Regulation 7, which we'll come to, that it would need to have fire resistance. But it would be, again, factor and degree, I think, on what plant you're supporting and what the purpose of that plant is. Let's not get outdoors, I promise. So that's loft conversions.
Sorry, can I add something? But
Yeah, of course.
5.3.2.
Yes.
Roofs, most of the time, roofs do provide stability to the external walls.
So it says the structure is essential for the stability of an external wall that needs to be fire resisting to achieve compartmentation or for the purposes of preventing fire spread between buildings. That's relating to B4, which we'll come to shortly, and or compartmentation. So if you have a pair of, again going back to the domestic instances, if you have a pair of semi-detached dwellings and the party wall is supported, by whatever reason, older properties tend to have it, by the roof structure, then yes, those roof elements, particularly if they pass through the wall, would need to have a fire resistance. If the party wall is independent to the roof, then no. I'll come on to B4, but what it means is with boundary conditions. If you have a boundary wall that needs a fire resistance due to, we'll come to B4, then yes, and it's supported by the roof, then yes, it would need to have a fire resistance.
That's when you do a roof conversion. The steels that support the floor are not the fire. The purlins that support the roof
Correct.
are not.
Exactly, because it's just the roof structure itself.
Another quick query on that.
Yeah, of course.
The fire resistance to the floors, etc. The BRE for
3.7.
yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
The one with fire resistance, and also the one where you convert as half-hour modified, okay, where the BRE tells you what modifications you can do, particularly in loft conversions, to upgrade the floors. Where does that come into the building regs, which I've used for years and years and years, but I've had a bit of a dispute with a couple of building inspectors recently about that.
Yep.
And he keeps on quoting me, RE, EI 30.
Yep.
And I said, well, here's the BRE report, that these actually comply.
Yes.
And we had to kind of like have a bit of debate with the chief of the building inspectors. So is that still considered pertinent to the building regs?
Yeah, can I come to that in 2 seconds? I promise I will. I'll come back to you and make sure I've answered your question. So I just want to highlight that the periods of fire resistance are listed in table B2, and for domestic instances, dwelling houses, the vast majority of cases, i.e. the height of the floor up to 5 metres will be 30 minutes, up to 11 metres going to 60 minutes, 60 minutes up to 18 and 13 and all the rest of it. I've listed blocks of flats in there, but we're not going to focus on that again. Now, I promise I will come to your question. So, B3. So, again, using a real example, this was the same project where we had a material change of use. Material change of use under 5A, B3 imposes a requirement. So this was actually a listed building. So the ground floor needed to have a fire resistance for those floor elements to the upper floors above. And what we actually did in this instance is provide 3 solutions, well, the designer did. To the rear of the building, the listed officer wasn't particularly interested because it was completely shattered in terms of dilapidations and all the rest of it. So we overboarded the existing ceiling, relatively simple, gypsum white plasterboard, and achieved the necessary fire resistance. Now to the front left-hand side and right-hand side, there were a number of decorative cornices and coping stones and similar, which the listed officer was very, very keen to reserve And in those instances, they came up with two different solutions. For the room onto the right-hand side here, they removed the floorboards, if I can speak properly, installed a mineral wall, which was supported and that provided the necessary fire resistance. And in the front left-hand side here, they installed, they went to a third-party manufacturer who then applied and certified the existing ceiling to be applied with an intermittent paint and similar. Now I'll come to your point there, because that project was about 7 years ago and things have slightly moved on, which I will come to, I promise. Garages, one thing to mention is that in a domestic situation, there is a requirement for fire resistance between garages and the rest of the dwelling itself. So that's for E30, 30 minutes fire resistance from the ceiling and the wall itself. And if we've got a door between the garage and the habitable space, that needs to be an FD30 door and needs to have a self-closer on with a cold smoke seal. We've talked a little bit about compartmentation. And this is the diagram which references all of that. So where we've got timbers passing through party walls and the need for fire-resistant construction across the compartmentation itself. So actually bringing in an additional requirement is known as B-Roof T4, which is also tested in accordance with 13501, as you guessed it. To be honest, the vast majority of tiles and clay tiles and similar to concrete tiles, pan tiles that we're going to have are going to achieve that classification of A2, S3, D2 or better. Again, smoke creation and droplet creation, it's going to be relatively simple from a clay tile or similar. Where this might kick in is if we've got a thatched cottage with a compartment wall, and then we're looking at additional requirements that we're going to need to adhere to that. And there's a piece of guidance called the Dorset model, which you can have a look at, which provides some really good guidance about those requirements. In essence, though, what we're looking at, compartmentation up to the underside of the roof covering and a space, a void of 1,500 millimetres either side, which maintains that fire resistance itself. Next bit I'm going to talk about is cavity barriers. And a couple of instances there on the left-hand side. So cavity barriers, often I see so many instances where cavity barriers are installed and they're not required, and then so many instances where they're required and they're not installed. But it's really quite simple, really. So diagram 5.3 of ADB is the relevant diagram to refer to. And what it says, basically, if you've got two leaves, traditional, as we would call, masonry construction, of brick or concrete and more than 75 mil thick, then the provisions of cavity barriers are really, really simple. You just need to close around the cavity and you need to put a cavity barrier at the top. And that mechanism, those provisions that you're putting in place, do not need to have a fire resistance. Because what you are trying to mitigate is the flue effect. In the event of a fire getting into that cavity of a block and a brick, we're trying to mitigate airflow from enabling the transfer or flame up in the concealed space of the wall itself. Now, anything that goes outside of that 75 mil, one other thing to mention, if you have a full fill cavity, you do not need cavity barriers. Again, I see this so often where they're popping them in, and yeah, you don't need them. Full fill cavity, 150 mil, mineral wall, you do not need to put cavity barriers in. Now, if you go outside of diagram 5.3, of any other construction method, timber frame, which I've shown on the left hand there, sit panels, any other modern methods of construction, if there is a cavity, then it needs to have a cavity barrier, and that should be in place for any surface going through, any edges of cavity, and closing around the top. Now, under diagram 5.3, 75 mil of brick and block externally and externally, there is no requirement for fire resistance. But under anything else outside of diagram 5.3, there is, which is E15 and I30. So integrity 15 minutes and I 30 minutes. Now, people get confused between cavity barriers and compartmentation. It's important to note compartmentation is generally within a domestic setting, 60 minutes between different dwellings, whereas cavity barriers is about stopping the spread of flame within the building itself. And therefore it has a reduced fire resistance that it needs to adhere to, even in a timber frame construction. Now, going back to your point, which you mentioned earlier on, sir. So, previously, BS 476, and it has been for 50, 60 years, has been the British standard that has been utilised to confirm the fire resistance of elements, and that's everything from external wall, roofs, insulation, doors, etc. And there's a number of bits of guidance, the IFE, which I mentioned before, work with Historic England. This is still published and available. And what happens is if a door is tested to that standard, BS 476, is given a designation, FD, and then given a period, which is 20 or 30 or 60, whatever it needs to be. It's important to note that ADB Amendment 2029, so not in force yet, has, and the reason why the government have given us so much notice of this amendment for approved document B is because it has such a massive impact on the industry as a whole. So because BS 476, part 22, is integral and widespread and consistent across industry in terms of a testing method to achieve and to confirm the fire resistance of a material. And because we're moving away from that, as a result of Grenfell Tower Phase 2, where it was highly criticised, being not fit for purpose, we are now going to a European standard, which is BSEN 13501. And this is when it gives the classifications of R, E, and I, which is R, resistance to collapse, low bearing capacity. We talked about R and E and I earlier on. E, which is integrity, which is resistance to fire penetration, and I, which is resistance to transfer of excessive heat, i.e. insulation. So you end up with a classification of R, E, I, and a time period, 30, 60, 90, whatever it is. Now, going back to your point, ADB 2029 obviously comes into force in 2029, and it's kicking in from the 2nd of September 2029. So it's not in force yet. However, the reason why government have given all the testing manufacturers so much warning is the ability to ramp up their testing standards in accordance with 13501. This has led to a number of testing manufacturers, most notably Gypsum, who tested their non-load bearing partitions in accordance with 13501 and found out that it didn't meet the necessary fire resistance if it had been tested in accordance with BS 476. I think it's reasonable to say, and I don't profess to be a fire engineer, but I think it's reasonable to say that BS 476 is much more malleable, it's much more dependent on human observation, whereas 13501 is much more specific and is much more quantitative in terms of the results that are produced. And I think that the feedback that you're getting is a result of manufacturers having tested against that standard and not achieving the requirements that they need to. And that's why Gypsum removed relatively recently a whole raft of their testing standards in terms of the White Book. So if you're looking for non-load bearing partitions in the Gypsum White Book, they've removed vast quantities of them. Does that answer your question? So the reason why kickback is coming in terms of those provisions, I suppose, is that manufacturers and industry are trying to ramp up and test in accordance with this new standards, and they are finding it more difficult to confirm their adherence to the new testing standard. Legally, it's still in ADB until 2nd of September 2029. So if you followed BS 476 Part 22 for a fire door up until the 2nd of September 2029, and it confirms that fire resistance, you followed the guidance within approved document B.
It's more a matter of modified, like we do for loft conversions.
Yeah.
Modified versions.
Yes.
Where the BRE is, I forget what the number is where most people go. So what we're saying is materials that they've got in there
Yes.
is probably now going to be deficient, and so that's going to have to go out the window as well.
That neatly leads me to my next point, because this, again, the same project, was the existing building converted material change of use, B3 imposes a requirement, and they retained the existing fire doors, and they went to a third party, I think it was Envirograph, other manufacturers are available, and they recommended the installation of beading around the door, they recommended the installation of intermittent strips, they applied an application of intermittent paint, which confirmed and they certified the doors in accordance with BS 476 to FD30 standard. Now, I think it's important to note, with all the stuff I've just said about 13501, which is much more specific, much more less malleable, if that's a term, that being able to certify existing products is going to become increasingly difficult over time. I think this is existing elements, because you cannot test an existing element, because by definition it's existing, it is increasingly difficult for you to be able to certify that. Now, what ADB does say is, and this goes back to the Grenfell Tower Phase 2 inquiry, where a certain panel system was proposed, they made one amendment, and that completely changed the way that that panel system reacted in the event of fire and its fire resistance. And what ADB says that it should have an extended field of application, certified under 13501, which says it can be used in these circumstances under these designs. And then if you change one of those designs, you should go off and speak to a competent professional to certify that that change that you have made will not have a necessary impact on the fire resistance of that component. The problem, of course, is the number of people that are, one, competent, and two, willing to certify that a change to a design will maintain the fire resistance, which is very difficult to do. We're going into fire science rather than fire engineering. The number of people able to do that is very, very difficult, which leads me on to the next point, existing elements, being able to make a judgment of an existing element in an existing building and confirm that it achieves the necessary fire resistance to 13501. Very, 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 very difficult going forward, I suspect. And I think you'll find additional kickback going forward. Yeah.
So that's, you're going to whip them all out, because I've got to get a whole lot certified. The frame, the door, everything, all we're going to do. Is that because they can afford?
Well, I think the ADB, as I said, I can't criticise other building control bodies, but ADB until 2029 still references BS 476 Part 22. So if you can get a door certified to that method, you are in accordance with ADB and you followed the statutory guidance sanctioned by government, tendency towards non-liability. I would point in that direction, in my humble opinion. Now, we'll come to the role of building control later in terms of what we can say and what we can't say and all those sorts of things, and instructing people, which shouldn't take place. But that's for the last session, in my humble opinion. Does that answer your question? I think it does. Yes, 5 minutes. Oh, I'm rambling on. B4, external fire spread. So B4, external walls of the building should adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls from one building to another, regard to the height. I will whistle stop through this. Now, Regulation 7, which I mentioned before, all Regulation 7 in the building regulations says is that the material and workmanship should be fit for purpose for its end use. Pretty simple, basically, which references the need for manufacturers' recommendations to be followed, all that sort of stuff. Now, what they did post-Grenfell, I think in 2018, is they stipulated and they defined what was known as a metal composite material, relevant metal composite material, and they banned that for all buildings of any height. What is a metal composite material, you will ask? It is a material which is like a sandwich panel of inner filling, which has a combustibility of 35 millijoules per kilogram, and its external and internal finish is less than 10 millimeters. Now, in a domestic setting, it's very, very rare that you're going to come across this type of building. The only instances that we have seen it, and I've only seen it on one occasion, is an agricultural building that was being proposed for a material change of use. And in those instances, it really doesn't work anymore because it's been banned of any building of any height. So even though it's an existing element, it wasn't able to meet the provisions of B3 and they ended up replacing it. And also, I know we've talked a lot about insurance and other things like that. As soon as it was identified of this type of material, the clients were like, we don't want it, the insurance guys didn't want it, came off, which resolved the issues. But just worthwhile mentioning that. Now, B4 more generally in a domestic setting, the first thing to talk about is boundaries. So there's two types of boundaries within fire safety. There's a relevant boundary and a notional boundary. A relevant boundary is a physical boundary. So that's hedge, fence, wall, etc. A notional boundary is an invisible boundary which you can place to make sure that both buildings comply. So using this building diagram from ADB, if building B had lots of unprotected area on that left-hand side elevation and building A had none, you would shift the notional boundary closer to building A to ensure that both could comply. That's the idea behind it. Of course, when a physical boundary then goes in, then it becomes a relevant boundary and you can't mess about with a notional boundary. Does that make sense? Relevant, notional? Perfect. So, unprotected areas. So when the concept behind this is as you get further away from a relevant boundary, the more unprotected area you can have. What is an unprotected area? Well, an unprotected area is, in essence, the surface finish of that external wall, we'll talk about walls now, being of a classification of BS3D2 or worse, again using the same European classification. Now there's two requirements. There's the surface spread of flame, which we'll come to next in terms of increasing the unprotected area. But if you are less than 1 metre from a relevant boundary, the maximum amount of unprotected area you can have is 1 metre, and also there's a requirement for fire resistance, not just surface spread of flame. And that requirement for fire resistance links back into table B2, which for a domestic dwelling house is 30 minutes fire resistance. So if you have unprotected area within 1 metre of a relevant boundary, the maximum unprotected areas that you can have is 1 metre squared, and anything beyond that needs to be both fire resistant, REI 30, and BS3 D2. As you get further away from that relevant boundary, you can increase the amount of unprotected area. So 1 to 2 metres, you can have 5.6 metres squared, 2 to 3 metres, 12 metres squared, 3 to 4, 18 metres squared, and on. Now there's method 1 in ADB, there's also method 2, and so you can increase the extent of unprotected area as you get further away from the relevant boundary. Right, so a little bit about roof coverings. Again, the concept is exactly the same. The further you are away from the relevant boundary, the classification that is permitted can be less onerous. So you're going down to B roof, C roof, D roof, E roof, and F roof. The further you get away, the more permissible it is. B5. So this is, again, Schedule 1. Access and facilities for fire service. The building should be designed and constructed so as to provide reasonable facilities to assist firefighters in the protection of life. Now, believe it or not, there's a number of golden rules in ADB, and I did a bit of CPD from Colin Todd, who's a very influential and famous fire engineer. He talks about the golden rules within ADB, one of which 18 metres apparently is from in the Edwardian period, where we had a ladder which was 15 metres and then a latch that handed on top of it which added an extra 3 metres, and we've just stuck with 18 metres. So that's the nature of it. Now, believe it or not, and I know this for a fact, ADB, the 20 metre rule, so 20 metre rule is if you've got a hammerhead situation, the expectation should be that the fire service shouldn't have to reverse more than 20 metres to be able to get to the building itself. And the reason this comes from is because that's the distance that in days when the fire appliances were towed by a horse, that a horse is expected to be able to reverse. So there you go. That's why we use 20 metres, which it's all good stuff. And anyway, so the requirement itself, basically, you can calculate where a fire appliance would be able to get to, and then what you need to do is from a route line from the point of the fire appliance to any point within the building itself, no more than 45 metres. And that's the hose length, presumably, or it could be something completely irrelevant. But that's what it says, 45 metres. And the width, again, table 13.1 provides a number of dimensions for appliances, 3.1 metres between gates, between road curbs of 3.7, turning circles and similar. When we talk about B5 and changing the gate width, for example, that's when it would come in. And also the provision of the road base should have a 12.5 tonne capacity as well. There's also some local acts in place, so different jurisdictions within England and Wales have different additional requirements, which is always a bit of a interesting one to distinguish. So Berkshire actually have a local act relating to access for the fire and rescue services. I've just highlighted this. So this was a Cross report. So again, if you're interested, I would highly recommend. Cross is a brilliant institution, in my humble opinion. They focus on structural engineering, but also fire engineering, and they request reports from professionals within the built environment. They then have a panel of experts who review the information and then provide an opinion on. So one of the things that they've highlighted is the provision of horizontal mains as a solution to meet vehicle access requirements. So because we live in leafy areas in the UK and you're trying to propose a new dwelling down a winding track and similar, often a proposal that's put forward by designers to building control and then to the fire and rescue services is for a dry riser installation, which enables the extension of that 20-metre rule. In essence, that horizontal main is increasingly not being accepted, and the reasons for it are numerous, which I won't go into now, but in essence is not fit for purpose as being able to be charged and therefore being able to be utilised to put the fire out in the event of a fire. So if you do have situations where you've got remote new dwellings that you're proposing in areas that a fire appliance wouldn't be able to get to, I think it's early engagement, building control, early engagement of fire and rescue service about a suitable provision. I think realistically you're looking at some sort of suppression system or similar. Cool. So I will ask you, as we did before, just to chat amongst yourselves, and hopefully this will be a nice way for you to refresh your memory after lunch about these 11 questions or so. Yeah, just chat amongst yourselves, make a note or don't. Have a thought about what you think the answers are. A couple of minutes and then we'll run through them. Happy? Should we have a quick stab at running through? Hopefully it's kept you awake a little bit after lunch. So, dimensions of an emergency escape window. Anyone? Yes? 450, 0.33, 1100. Definition of an inner room. Perfect, yeah, so the means of escape is only through another room, in essence. Proposed loft conversion to form a three-storey dwelling has the stair terminating into the lounge. Is this permissible? Yeah. Correct, yes, it could be, but you need to have additional measures. So it doesn't meet the provisions of protected stairway, but in ADB, you can have provisions talk about doors separating from ground to first floor, escape window in place for the occupants of the second floor, and a sprinkler system in accordance with 9251 covering the open areas. British standard for smoke alarm systems in domestic premises. Perfect. 5839-6 for domestic premises, 5839-1 for non-domestic premises. What classification for internal linings is required for circulation spaces? Table 4.1. It's a tough one. Class C S3D2, basically. N12 circulation spaces in flat B S3D2. Period of fire resistance for a dwelling house with a higher story of 4.5 metres.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, perfect. Does a timber frame building cavity wall require cavity barriers?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, anything outside of that diagram 5.3, 75mm internal and external skin, then we're looking for the need of cavity barriers. An elevation of a proposed extension has 20 metres square cladding with a relevant boundary of 1.5 metres away. Is this permissible? What measures could be explored? So firstly, if we've got a relevant boundary 1.5 metres away, what's the maximum amount under method 1 of unprotected area you can have? 5.6, yes. So it's not going to be permissible with cladding 20 metres squares because that's in excess of that. What could we do potentially?
Fire rated cladding.
Yeah, fire rated cladding or a retrospective application of that existing cladding in place. Bearing in mind that we need to achieve the S3D2 and the 13501. What fire resistance and reaction to fire requirements are detailed for a dwelling house with a higher story of 4.5 metres with a relevant boundary less than 1 metres away? So firstly, what's the maximum amount of unprotected area we can have for less than a metre? 1 metre squared. Perfect. And fire resistance, what's the fire resistant requirements for a dwelling house? 30 minutes, perfect. And then reaction to fire requirements would be, tough one, BS3D2 that we're looking at. An extension is proposed with six non-fire rated windows in place, 5.6 metres apart with an area of 0.99. A relevant boundary of 1.2 metres away. Is this permissible?
Yes.
Very good. So we need to look back at, find it, that diagram down the left-hand side there. So if you've got, I know we're in a bit of a rush at the end, but if you've got unprotected areas of less than a metre that are more than 4 metres apart, then they can be discounted. So if you, a pretty unlikely situation, but if you have a long building with windows spaced more than 4 metres apart, which are less than 1 metre squared, then they can be discounted in terms of those provisions.
What about less than a metre?
No.
No, at all.
None at all. 1 metre squared. I was going to come on to that, but you're completely right. Yeah, less than a metre is much more about, 1 metre max. Should not. A new dwelling is proposed with a driveway of 50 metres. Is this possible?
Yes.
Potentially. Potentially. So they can put a hammerhead in place, they can put a turning circle in place, or they can look at mitigation measures as long as it's in accordance with the fire authority's requests. And that very much, I said no, but potentially. Anyway, so there you go, that lists all those requirements. Any questions on ADB Volume 1 at all? Yes?
I know the answer, but I can't get my head around it.
That's fine.
So, modern 21st century terraced house
Yep.
in a modern scheme, truss rafter roofs.
Yep.
You're saying that the timber spandrel panels, separation between roof spaces in that situation, they don't need to be resistant to fire.
No. So the compartmentation, that's a compartment.
Yeah.
And the compartment needs to be 60 minutes fire resistance between dwellings. That, and so spandrel panels in that instance would need to maintain 60 minutes fire resistance
Cool. Okay.
in both directions. What doesn't need to be, to have a fire resistance is the roof structure either side of that. So your truss rafters, either side of that does not have to have a fire resistance.
Okay.
Brilliant. So that's ADB, Volume 1. Hopefully answered it.